Good morning. Continuing review summary of the conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis. We are on page 1464. 1464. The top of the page, closer to the top of the page. And after a little, let's say, introduction, explanation of the Rebbe Rashab in the very concept that Shemen, in the Moshel of Ner Hashem Nishmasadim Ner, the candle, the oil, represents the intelligence, human intelligence, including that of the animal soul, the Seichel of the Nefesh Habamis, Chachma of the Nefesh Habamis. So the Rebbe Rashab went through a few key points that help elaborate on the Alter Rebbe's premise, because it's the Alter Rebbe that makes that statement in the Maimer HaMagbi L'Shavis. And just summing up, namely, the key points were that there's Chachma and Shemen within everything in existence, not just in Kedusha, but in every aspect of existence, because Kulam B'Chachma Sisa, God's wisdom. You can think of the artist's wisdom is embedded in every detail of his design, of his creation, of his product. And as he elaborated what Chachma is, the different levels of Chachma, Hiyuli, Koyach Klali, bottom line, exists in every aspect of existence. That's one point. And the Shemen is the purest, the finest part. I like the word finest. Hamuvcher Shabedavar, the finest of in the core, the Techis Primius of that whatever that dover, that object of which the Shemen and the Chachma are within. Then there's holy Shemen, sacred whole oil, and there's Shmonim, which the rest of the oils, which are Chachma of Noiga, the explanation of Klippas Noiga, and Zayis, that's connected to forgetfulness, which is connected to the Klippa, which now explains how it also enters into a world of Klippa that can be refined and elevated. And from that, he goes back and explains one more point, which is the Shviras HaKelim, that the Shvira in Das and in the Midas below Das is what caused this dissonance. You can say this rift, maybe breach, is also a good word that allows for the Chachma of Kedusha to enter into to create Klippas Nega and the broken or the shattered containers and the sparks within them, the 288 sparks. So higher than Das, Chachma and Bina, there is no Shvira. Even though Acharayim in their outer dimension, there is, as he brought in the parentheses from Eitz Chaim, but not the inner dimension. But nevertheless, even after the Shvira, there's still Chachma within Zah. There's Chachma within Chesed, Chachma within Gvura. So the Midas, where there was a Shvira, which is Nega, there is Chachma within that. And that Chachma, so all these points help explain how Shemen and Chachma end up in an animal soul of all places. Then he continued to explain that even the Nefesh Habamis, just like we said, the Midas there's Chachma, the Nefesh Habamis also has Chachma, Seichel and Chachma. Even though it's primarily a Midas entity, because the animal, first of all, a physical animal, it's driven by its impulses, which are hardwired, what he called TV, be'etzem, and that's why it's called behema, because it doesn't have that type of objective intelligence that can control, like moyach shal talev, that have self-control. Its impulses are its driving force, but still it does have seichel, as we see. Every creature has seichel to some extent, and even more so when it comes to nefesh habamis of a person. Even though, yes, there's also midas tivim, which are drawn to and are attracted to taivas atzmei, meaning pleasures that satisfy the individual. Ruach habehema yeredes lamata. Nevertheless, a nefesh habamis also has seichel, and even more so than behema gashmis. As we see, a human being's nefesh habamis is not quite as, let's call it, hardwired as an animal. we see we could tame the nefesh habamis. When it comes to an animal, no one looks to make the nefesh habam, the animal, love God. Here, in the case of the human, as we're going to learn, we could ultimately harness it. So the seichel is of a higher level than in the actual behemoth, but it's still fundamentally like a nefesh, like a behemoth, which means it's driven initially by its impulsive midas, and we're going to obviously be learning how we elevate that through our Aveda, Shema Yisrael, V'hafta, and so on. So we're literally middle of the discussion of what is this behemoth like. I'll read a few lines from what we've read and just continue from there. So on page 1464, the line, let me see. So something again. The nefesh habamis yeshke gam ken seichel. That's what's called the nefesh habamis. So just like the behemoth, ein lo das, and its primarily intelligence is towards its own pleasures, its own needs. Or he says, "Ein das rak mashtalanos." It's only das is for its own pleasure. Kamei kein nefesh habamis hu midas tivim shenimshach achad taivas atzmei. So too, I'm reading from the line atzmo, when the lines can be found, the text can be found at ayinbeis.com. So the nefesh habamis is midas tivim, natural, you can say natural reflexive or natural emotions, impulses, shenim shechachad taivas atzmei, that are drawn and follow and are attracted to taivas atzmei, its own pleasures. V'hu ruach habehema yeredes lamata, and that's the spirit of the animal that is turned downward. As we'll soon discuss, that even the physiological structure of an animal is different than a man. We'll get to that in a moment. U'makom mokim, nevertheless, bezeh yisreine ala behema agashmis. This is all the Mittler Rebbe's language, actually, as I mentioned yesterday. This is its advantage, and it's a quality over of actual physical behema. Sheyesh b'seichel gamkein, that also has intelligence. What he means here is a behemoth also has intelligence, but it's an intelligence that can go beyond and actually suppress and control the natural midas. By animal, you can't expect an animal to fast on Yom Kippur, for example, or to not eat when it has to eat, or breathe, and so on. There, it's driven, like he said, it's hardwired that way. It has seichel how to do it, but the seichel is not strong enough to suppress its natural impulses. Whereas in a human being, yesh b'seichel gamkein. And now, here's where we stop, but we'll continue. And we see that also in its physiological structure, that an actual animal walks on all four, and a human being walks upright, including the animal soul in the human being. Shehelich became a skufa. A human being walks upright, which means our legs are below and our head is upward, became a skufa. V'loi became a kfufa, and not in not reclined is not the right word. Kfufa is the opposite of skufa. Skufa is upright.
Hunched over, hunched over, what? Hunched over, bent over.
Bent over, okay. I think there's an actual word of how an animal, but bottom line is the head of the animal and its feet are all equal. It's like when we lie down. It's a state of like lying down. But so there's that distinctive.
You mean prone? Prone?
Maybe, yeah. That may be the word, yeah. And that's in the entire human race. Why is that? I think this is the Mittler Rebbe. I'm not sure if that's from the Mittler Rebbe or the Rebbe Rashab. He's showing how every human being has that feature. So what is the significance of that? It's not just a structural thing. It's because the seichel of a person is higher than his midas. So if you look at a person upright, where's the seichel? It's in the head. The midas are in the heart. If you think of an animal, the midas in the heart and the seichel are all on the same level because it's prone or leaned over or bent over. So just to embellish on that a bit, I mentioned yesterday the Frierdiker Rebbe has an expression, one of his siches, a behemoth hat kemel nish gesehen de shamayim. A behemoth hat kemel nish gesehen himmel. Translated from Yiddish, An animal never sees heaven, or never saw heaven, never sees heaven. Why? Because it walks, as I said, it walks on all four. And where's its head primarily? It looks downward. Why is that the case? Because that's what an animal is made for. Its physiological structure reflects its personality. What's its personality? Is to live, is to fulfill what God wants it to do, which is to do whatever the function of an animal is, and to eat and to breathe and take care of its young. So it has no reason to be looking upward. A human being has a purpose, not just to survive and exist, but to be transcendent. So we stand upright and we look upward. The seichel helps us imagine and we can envision realities greater than our own. And to use a simple example, all the animals in the world, no matter how many years have passed, are not looking to improve their habitats. You don't see them building technologies, smartphones, fax machines, cars, planes, cities. The animals as we see them today are exactly as they were 1,000 years ago. Humans are constantly looking to improve their lives because they have a seichel that's beyond just existence and survival. Just look at the $1 trillion industry built by NASA, simply because human beings saw the stars and the cosmos, and we're curious. We want to know what's up there. Is there life on other planets? What's out there? So there's that natural curiosity. I'm not even speaking now in Kedusha. But when you add the Kedusha element, of course, that's the expression. Lift your eyes to heaven, lift your eyes upwards, and see who created you. So the human being, therefore, their physical structure, their keli, reflects their their personality, which is to go beyond structure of existence. And that's what the Frierdiker Rebbe meant, that an animal doesn't see heaven. That doesn't need to see heaven. Now, on the other hand, keep in mind what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that animals also never waver from the program. They never sin or transgress. They're like a computer program. They're a program exactly as God put them. A human being has the ability to go beyond, but also has the ability to destroy, God forbid, and go lower than the purpose for which we were created. It's not really the point relevant to our discussion here, but just wanted to make that clear. So bottom line is, the physical structure of an animal reflects the fact that it's midas, and it's primarily midas, and even the seichel, not primarily, it's only midas, and the seichel is all around its emotional needs. Basically, it's subjective survival and existence. And the nefesh habamis is also midas tivim, that's why it's called behema, but it has that yisrin, it has that quality, one step above, and that's why obviously you can train and tame and refine and elevate and harness the animal soul, which is, of course, the theme that we're getting to. But that's the distinction. But at the same time, it's still called nefesh habamis because, as we all know, we don't need much proof. We know what our animal soul gravitates to on its own, without effort and without discipline. So now and that's what he's now going to elaborate on. He made this distinction, but the key, which is critical to understand how and why we can elevate the nefesh habamis, like he spoke earlier about the zayis, that those that can elevate it, even though it itself is in the world of klippus nega. So nefesh habamis is chachma of nega, and therefore it has a common denominator with an actual animal, but it also has the element of chachma and element of that can be ultimately harnessed. Rakshasechel v'hadash shaloi ikre, and here he says ikre. However, even though it does walk upright and therefore has a certain element of called transcendent element, certain element that's higher than midas, but seichel v'dash shaloi of the nefesh habamis, now we're talking about ikre primarily, hu binyanim gashmim. It's in material matters and physical things. In betzarchei gufei, whether it's physical bodily needs, b'meshu chayfetz u'mesave, in the things that he desires and has craves for. For example, where would that seichel play itself out? To find methods and ways to become wealthy, to acquire, to gather treasures and wealth, or glory and honor. So we see a human being, a nefesh habamis, has its needs. So tzarchei gufe could be simply eating and sleeping and drinking, but it could also be we innovate. We innovate ways to succeed in becoming wealthy. Parnasa, we see people have innovated tremendous businesses and ideas and creativity and so on, or honor and glory, or glory and honor. That's one. Or we see how people use their intelligence to represent themselves. Let's say someone says something about you and you want to defend yourself. So you know how if you're a smart person or a human being with intelligence knows to come up with all kinds of intelligent ways of demonstrating demonstrating your merits, betuv tam v'seichel, with a legitimate and a solid case of p intelligent ukai gavna. That's like etc. and other examples. So this is straight from the Mittler Rebbe. Actual examples of how the seichel of the nefesh habamis is at work. Now, clearly, this is not seichel of kedusha, but it also doesn't mean necessarily seichel that's prohibited. We're not talking about necessarily anything that nothing he said here is transgressing any God forbid any law in the Torah. However, it is an intelligence, and it's an intelligence that two things. It demonstrates that it's ikre mides because it's all about you, of you succeeding. But it's not just like an animal that's purely survival. It has innovative qualities and brilliance even. Hakol b'seichel hashayich l'midas. So even when the seichel v'das is primarily around the seichel hashayich l'midas. It's not pure abstract ideas. It's about how to gain wealth, how to gain honor, how to represent yourself, how to look good. Now, all the things, building a reputation would be an interesting way of putting letzaded b'schusei. Doesn't say those exact words, but it's the same idea. So all this is around you and your success. So that's why he calls it midas, because it's not driven by pure abstract truth. It's not just the search for truth, it's the search for making your life a better life, basically. And that ultimately is midas because it has subjective interest here. Now he goes further. Now keep in mind, I just want to point this out. This is the Mittler Rebbe's language that the Rebbe Rashab is citing, explaining the Maimer now, the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe in Torah only says the following. If you look inside the language, I don't have it in front of me, but we learned it, but I remember. He says like this: the Seichel Nefesh Habamis is primarily about itself, but he doesn't give examples. The Mittler Rebbe in classic style, remember the Alter Rebbe is like Chachma, the Mittler Rebbe like Bina, does elaborate and gives these examples. So these examples are helping understand. This is another example of what I said yesterday, seeing how the Rabbeim develop the ideas. So the Alter Rebbe says it in a Nakuda. It's clear what he says, but still, with examples, makes it a lot clearer. So the Mittler Rebbe embellishes on it, the Mittler Rebbe develops it, and of course the Rebbe Rashab, we see how the Rebbe Rashab developed it even further, like we discussed the whole introduction to Chachma of Nega, Chachma Shemen within existence. So here is all this is the Mittler Rebbe's language. If you want to see it inside, you go to Mittler Rebbe's Maimer that we learned, page 366, 367. The Maimer, the Chanukah Maimer, the 75 approximately page Maimer that we learned. So now he's going further. This, what we just said, is Seichel Shaykh Lamidus. But we know an Nefesh Habamis is also capable of abstract thinking. Let's say a scientist. And he's not doing it for glory or for a Nobel Prize or for money or for anything like that. There is the idea of the mind at work. That's not necessarily to become wealthy or to find fame or honor or for your reputation or to represent yourself. So he continues. And what about seichel of the nefesh and wisdom that is not connected to midas tivim? In other words, it's not about your survival, your needs, your nature, your natural instincts to take care of your own self. No, the self-interest. Amukis bilimudies chitzenius. Like, for example, the ideas in comprehending concepts and theories, deep concepts, in limud chitzenius. Chitzenius essentially means secular wisdom, science, math, medicine, law, whatever, the whole body of intelligence that exists, whether in the physical sciences, the social sciences, or the political sciences. There's a whole body of wisdom out there. And that is not connected directly to midas tivim shebelev. You could still say, I'm studying it because I enjoy it, but it's not directly linked to my needs, my self-interest, so to speak. It does have objective value. So how about that? And he gives here examples as well. Kamoy b'chochmas hateva. Chochmas hateva literally means science. Chochmas hateva means literally the wisdom of nature, study of nature. That's what it's called. V'chochmas hatchuna, astronomy, the wisdom of astronomy. V'chochmas harafua, the wisdom of medicine. Ukahai gavna, again similar. All these are intelligence that are not driven by Torah and godliness. They could be directed there, but on their own, they're neutral, and they're not necessarily around midas hativim. Nevertheless, here's an interesting way he puts it. Nevertheless, this only in order to comprehend the material world. So it's not true, it's not necessarily driven by self-interest, but it's still about understanding existence. It's not understanding that which is beyond existence. A smart person wants to, so to speak, open up the clock to see what makes things tick. That's really the essence of real intelligence. It's understanding what's behind the scenes, what are the causes behind all the effects of this world. That's essentially all wisdom, is looking to understand what makes things work. So it's really all around the akshama of this world. Why is this relevant? We'll soon discuss it, but let's first read inside, and I'll explain it more in detail as we go along. I want to see first what he says. So this is its point. The intelligence here is to understand existence, which means what means akshama? It means things as they are in the materialistic level. This is not trying to dismiss it as that the person is a materialistic person. It means it's around materialism. That's what it means, meaning around existence. He's using that first example, like the wisdom of nature. How do you b'chol geshem? So you're studying nature. Nature could be biology, it could be it's chemistry, anything that is studying the nature of the nature of objects in existence. Nature here doesn't mean necessarily only botany, for example. It includes chemistry, physics would be included in the chochmas hateva. So what is it doing? So he says, b'chol geshem eichshehu murkav. It's a study of taking every geshem, taking an object, taking an element, taking, let's say, hydrogen or oxygen or water, whatever that geshem is, and dissecting eichshehu murkav, how it's a composite, v'chol protei chalkeo, and you want to dissect all the details that comprise of this object. That's what it is. Like whenever you think of a scientist, what do you think? They take, let's say, a leaf from a tree, they put it under a microscope, begin to study it, all its fine details, maybe cut it up, or if it's another object, you may dissect it, open it up to see what it's made of. That's essentially the first level of observation. Now today we have even more sophisticated instruments. We have electromagnetic microscopes. We have all kinds of ways to see farther and deeper, and even explore things that may be not invisible to the naked eye. But all it is, like he's saying here, is dissecting and understanding how whatever geshem it may be. This goes back from the beginning of time when any scientist, any thinker was trying to understand something. That's what they did. They took apart the geshem to see what it's made of. And of course, you also test it. You put it under heat, cold, under pressure, etc. So, Now, we know this is not necessarily what the scientist knows or the person who's doing this. She says these details are coming. So it is the koyach haliki within it. All these molecules and subatomic particles or DNA or whatever it is that we're studying, they are coming from the koyach haliki that embedded itself. Or you could say the chachma of Hashem that we talked about earlier, that's embedded in all of existence. But from the point of view of the student or the scientist or the chacham sateva, it's about how it's dafke b'bchinas yesh dafke. So it's a koyach haliki in truth, but it's manifested in b'chinas yesh. So when you open it up, you're not going to see godliness. If you are wise and you contemplate on it, and that's already your avodah, and we're going to discuss that, how we harness that wisdom towards elikus. But on its own, it's elikus b'chinas yesh dafke. That's what he's explaining, what means hakshama. When he said b'chinas hakshama. So you're understanding not the divine energy, you're understanding the forces that the divine energy created that make this thing, that give it its properties and its qualities, and you understand it well. It's a profound wisdom, like he said before. Omuk, amuk, seichlis, sichlis, chachmes, amukes, sichlis, umuskolis, amukes. But it's all in the yesh. The Kolshkein, he says now, I think this parenthesis is the Rebbe Rashab's addition. This is about the study of nature, basically science. Well, I shouldn't say science because astronomy is also science, but the study of the objects of that exist in nature, to put it in simple terms. The Kolshkein says, he adds now, Sharia Chochmas, the other wisdoms, Kitchuna, like astronomy, Refuah, and medicine. Those are the other two examples he gave. Shein b'bchinas hayesh. That they're all about understanding the yesh. So it's a seichel, but it's a seichel of the yesh, essentially, understanding the yesh. Now, what's the kolshkein? Interesting discussion. Why is this even more so than nature? In other words, understanding astronomy is more megushim, more yesh than the understanding, let's say, botany or chemistry. So I think I discussed it the first time we learned. My understanding of it is because it could be because your refuah, and the same thing with medicine. Why is medicine more of a yesh? Why is it kolshkein? So I'll let everybody speculate on that. I have to think about it myself and maybe go back to what I said then. I don't remember what I said back then. But he just said it says kolshkein. He could have just said Shari Chachmas, the same in the Shari Chachmas, Kolshkein even more so. And for sure that's the case with astronomy and refuah. Shehem b'bchinas hayesh. So I'm going to stop here. First of all, if anyone has any questions or if somebody wants to comment why they think there's a Kolshkein here, we'll stop here. Because this is all, bottom line, let's sum it up. The Seichel of the Nefesh Habamis, which is superior to actual animal, because all this that we just discussed, that animals not capable of studying astronomy or medicine or nature or so on. Nevertheless, firstly, most of the ikr is midas, meaning about yourself and your needs, self-interest. And even the seichel that is not driven around midas is all about the yesh and the geshem. Nefesh halikisa, by contrast, which will really help us understand the animal soul, is a very different interest, as we're going to learn afterwards. But I'm going to stop here before we get to Nefesh Halikis. He's going to say, Nefesh Halikis, its interest is godliness. That the Nefesh Habamis does not have on its own. It could be trained, but it doesn't have that on its own. And this is going to be the contrast, the stark contrast between the animal soul seichel and the seichel of the Nefesh Halikis, which again is the Alter Rebbe's lays down the premise and the idea. Mittler Rebbe is elaborating, and the Rebbe Rashab is further elaborating as we're learning here. So let's stop from here. If anybody wants to ask anything, or as I said, if you want to speculate or any ideas why it's a kolshkein.
A question and a comment. The question is how you're teaching about 6 lines up, or litzada bischuso.
Yeah.
I mean, how are you
representing his merits would be the exact translation.
Uh-huh.
But it really means about like Essentially, your reputation includes basically the using intelligence to present yourself and your qualities to
Oh,
others.
I see. I see. The only comment, if he's saying the Kolshken Shari like astronomy and medicine, I wonder if he's saying these are at the root of all the other Gashmidic desires or essences. So
No,
like,
no, 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 no,
no, you don't think?
no, for sure not. He's saying that because we're not talking about desires. He's now
Uh,
talking about seichel on its own. In seichel itself, it's a kolshken. For some reason, it seems to be more yeshes, dealing more with the yesh than chachmas hateva. It sounds like chachmas hateva is a more refined science, whereas astronomy and medicine seems to be more. It could be very
directly
simple.
Gashmidic? Hmm.
So it could very be simple. The reason is because teva includes molecules and atoms, whereas the astronomy and refuah maybe are more about the tangible things in this world. That could be
Hmm.
the simplest explanation. Not sure.
Hmm. And if you were to consider that the human intellect is capable of other intellectual insights, such as philosophy, for example, would you say that's really the nefesh Eloki that's seeking something transcendent, maybe
No,
not?
no, no, no. As a matter of fact, there's a reason he's not bringing philosophy, secular philosophy, because there you're already going into the world that may be anti-God.
Mm,
So he's
really?
not bringing philosophy. He doesn't bring philosophy here very deliberately. He's bringing actual, these are all the physical sciences primarily, or
Eh,
psychology for that matter. So
eh,
that's already treading in a different. I don't want to talk about that right now. We'll talk about
okay,
that afterwards. Um,
okay.
uh, but basically, he's talking here actual real science. I mean, philosophy and psychology. Yes, people are smart, but it doesn't necessarily. It's not necessarily grounded in facts. But when we talk about Nefesh Elokis, I'll get back to that.
Okay.
Are there any other questions or comments? Anybody?
One thing I'm struggling right now for a few months about the heart, that we have two different episodes when the God said, "I will let you to go according to your heart desire." At the same time, we know that the prophet said that at the end of the time, I will change your heart of stone into the heart of flesh. This is interesting how it correlates with the Chokhmah HaGeshen, like the Chokhmah of flesh and Chokhmah of Elohim, as opposite with a lev, that stone is more like inanimate object, and when God said, "I will change it to take your heart of stone and change it to the heart of flesh," is it about the desire? Lev is about the desire.
Well, this is to me, you're processing a lot here that I don't
I
even
know.
follow
I
because
know.
this is really nothing to do with Ayin Beis. This is your own processing. You yourself have pointed out when others people process that they should first focus on what we're learning
I
here.
know.
So
I know.
what
Just
you're
because
discussing is your own. I think we should discuss it out of this class structure because it's not relevant to, it's relevant to your journey, which is fine and very legitimate, and I'm validating it, but it's not connected to anything we're learning here. At least not that I see.
I know. It's just because it's
Okay,
coincidence.
so
Yes.
let's since there's other people in the class, and it's also for posterity. It's not. I'd rather address that in a different venue. Okay. Anybody else want to ask or comment on anything? If not, we'll continue. Okay, so that's the seichel of the nefesh habamis. How about the nefesh alikis? The seichel aliki, the nefesh alikis, the divine intelligence, and here he uses the word aliki. of the animal, of the divine soul rather, hu hepech zeh mamish, diametric opposite mamish, literally, of what we just read about, and what we just learned about the seichel of nefesh habamis. Shemasig b'bechinas haruchnius. And now you really can appreciate, by contrast, because what is the seichel of nefesh lakis is trying to understand ruchnius, the spirit within everything, not dissecting the gashmius to its core. So in a sense, the intelligence of the nefesh habamis, what he calls the different sciences we described, is actually going even more into gashmius, because not just you understand it on a superficial level, you understand it in its intricate detail. Nefesh Elokis has a very different interest altogether. It's interested in the koyach eliki, like he put it before, in the spiritual part, the ruchnius. B'ubchinas ha'ayin eliki. The nefesh Elokis' seichel is to understand the ayin eliki, not the yesh. What lies behind the forces that the scientists is arriving at? Behind the molecules and the atoms and subatomic particles, behind the DNA, behind all these microscopic or whatever forces that define existence, that there's a koyach eliki, the ayin eliki, a mahava called bria bria, that creates every creation. Liyesh mitzias davar, creates it to be a yesh mitzias davar. So essentially, the chos seichel of nefesh habamis, chochma nefesh habamis, goes as far as you can go in understanding the yesh, and the seichel of nefesh elokis goes beyond the yesh into the ayin that created the yesh. Like I've mentioned a number of times, I've spoken many times with scientists. I say, so what do you say before the Big Bang? The ball of gas that was there before, how did it get there? So I remember one scientist telling me, that's pure speculation, that's metaphysics. Because we as scientists have no way of knowing. We can only know once we see something, we can dissect and extrapolate and try to theorize, how did it get here? Not how did it get here. What is it made of and how it evolved? So we know there's a ball of gas. For some reason, there was this powerful reaction that created the Big Bang. That in turn created a whole series and triggered a whole series of events, ultimately creating stars and planets and all the theories that astronomers and scientists try to understand. Not getting into the merit or not merit of it. But it's all understanding the yesh from once it became a yesh. The discussion, how did the yesh get there in the first place, which is calling here the ayin eliki, is outside the realm of science. And we all agree to that. That's why you don't ask a scientist that question. Scientists can't answer that question. Just like they can't answer where it came from, they also can't say it didn't come from somebody. So, for example, like Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science, said a scientific theory, I actually quoted in one of the notes in my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, a scientific theory, by definition, not only has to be proven, it has to be able to be disproven. That's what the definition of science is. And he gives an example. To say God exists, he said, is not a scientific statement because you can't disprove it. He doesn't say you can't prove it. He says you can't disprove it because it's outside of the realm of the scientific domain. You can speculate, but then you're not speaking with someone. Why does a scientist know more about God than a child? Because God is the world of ayin, meaning God, I mean here, I don't mean atzmos, I mean the koyach eliki that creates existence, is the step before the yesh. And a human being can only, with seichel, figure out a yesh. Now, it doesn't mean we don't have the seichel of nefesh elokis to go further, but on its own, the seichel of nefesh habamis goes as far as the yesh. They can take it as far as humanly possible. And you've also hear scientists that say, I've reached, that with science I've reached here, now I need faith to go further. Especially scientists that have faith, or at least declare their faith. I think all scientists understand, as Einstein said, the more you understand science, the more you understand God, because you realize that the wonder of it all. But I'm talking now the pure science of it can only go to the end of the yesh. Nefesh elokis now takes us into a whole new world. And that world is the hepech. It's the nefesh elokis is only interested in the ruchnius, not the gashmius. What brought it all into existence? What made it be the way it is? V'hainu b'chol davar. This is the Rebbe Rashab's line over the Mittler Rebbe, explaining the Mittler Rebbe. Very nice, beautiful way how the Rebbe Rashab explains this. So what exactly is this study, that's called the Seichel of the Nefesh Elikis, doing? To see how b'chol dover, in every object, in everything, b'chol dover means not just object, in every entity, everything in existence, eichu ma, how and what, hu b'b'chinas haruchnis. What is its spiritual nature? What is its spiritual aspect? So a scientist would look, let's say, looking at a drop of water. A scientist would take it and dissect it and figure out it's made up of H2O, hydrogen and oxygen, and they would heat it or freeze it and figure out all the properties of the water. What would a Seichel of Nefesh Elikis do? It would figure out how and what is the ruchnius in it. What is the spiritual aspect of this water? Represents chesed, represents purity, represents das, as the Rambam says, mei hadas hatoyer. So it's a very different, two people, well, I'm just using an example, but two people, two types of seichel. One is interested in the geshem, in understanding the yesh, which has value and wisdom, no doubt. And one is trying to understand the ayin eliki, or what he calls the b'chinas haruchnis. Ve'eich she'esavusa hu ma'ayin. And additionally, how it came from an ayin and became a yesh. How did it come from such a spiritual, sublime reality and become a tangible, concrete? How did it become congealed into a physical object? And the manner that happened. How it happened, and the details of the dynamics that made that happen. All this is the Nefesh Elikis probing. So the soul, the scientist of the soul, is different than the scientist of the geshem, of the material. You could say maybe a soul scientist and a matter scientist. I don't know, I just came up with that. So, v'hainu, which means hafla ba'efnei savus. So it's more than just knowing, it's also the hafla, the absolute wonder. Now remember, even a scientist, a physical scientist, is also amazed. It's also wonder. But this is a whole level, another level of wonder of how this came to be, how a spiritual entity ultimately evolved into a physical one. As we learned earlier when we talked about Hamayich Be'echad, I think that's when he spoke about the hafla, the hafla of creation, and the eifan hafla, and the way, the method that was used to create. Continuing, the eich shekol bria betela, yet another part of the intellectual pursuit of the Nefesh Elikis. There's another point. So we said so far a few points. First, to see the ruchnius in everything. Two, how it came from ayin. Three, the oifen, the manner. And now one more thing, how all of creation, betela, the eiksha kol bria betela b'mitziyusa. The final point, that all of existence therefore is bottle, completely nullified, completely sublimated, b'mitziyus in its existence, v'kolom mamash chshiva, and it's considered like nothing compared to the ayin eliki that's creating it. That's all this all the seichel of the nefesh elikis. Mashenkin, ha-seichel the nefesh habamis. To go back, by contrast, the seichel, the intelligence of the animal soul, hu b'hakshama b'hayeshes. It's in the hakshama, it's in the congealed, it's in the very matter. And yeshes doesn't necessarily mean arrogance, just means in the substance, dafke. So one is in the ruchnis and one is in the gashmis. V'hainu b'pnei shegam sichlehu b'chinas ruach habehema hashayacha rak lemidus. Why is that the case? Because at the end of the day, it's the seichel of a nefesh habamis. Yes, it's more sublime and more subtle than an actual animal, and that's why it has all these levels of intelligence, and it doesn't have a level of objectivity. But at the end of the day, it's coming from ruach habehema, hayuredas lamata. Mata meaning the yesh, which has a connection to midis. So even though it may not be per se subjective, meaning for your interest, but it's still connected to the midis as they relate to existence. Ulateva, he says, like the midis, ulateva hakshama, and to the nature of the substance of existence. And what is the root of this? This is how he explains why it's midis. Ubesharshe, what is the root? Lamaila, that would be not chachma on its own, but who mechinas chachma shebezah, canal. That's the chachma shebezah. Remember on the top of the page when he said even after the shvira that created noiga, after the shattering the Noiga, there's Chachma within Midas. But it's a Chachma within Midas. Now, obviously, signs below is not the Chachma of Midas of Atzilus. However, the root of where it began, remember, was the Chachma that went into Noiga, which is the Chachma in Midas, and that evolves after Shvira and after everything we spoke about, that ultimately is the Chachma of the Nefesh Habamis. Like he said, that's where the root of the Seichel of the Nefesh Habamis, and that's why its interest is the Yesh, which is connected to that level of Midas and Teva HaKshamim. So on a subtle level, it's the difference between Chachma itself and Chachma higher than the Shvira would be Chachma of the Nefesh Alikis, and the Chachma after the Shvira, meaning in the Midas, would be Chachma of the Nefesh Habamis in the different levels he just discussed. First, a Chachma that's around self-interest, and the second is the Chachma around the Yesh and the Akshama of existence. And that's the difference between Nefesh Alikis Nefesh Habamis, Seichel of the Nefesh Alikis Nefesh Habamis, which, as I said, is mostly the language of the Mittler Rebbe, based on the Alter Rebbe, with a few additions of the Rebbe Rashab. And that concludes this paragraph. So, let me stop for any questions. If there are any questions. Quite well. I mean, I don't want to compliment the Rebbe Rashab. It's not really my role to do that. But I would say this was, relatively speaking, quite explained very directly. Didn't need a lot more of my own explanation. Wasn't as abstract as some other more of the mystical or cryptic ideas and Kabbalistic ideas. I hope you agree.
How are you explaining or translating this notion or phrase ruach behem? I understand it's the spiritual or the spiritual nature of the behem and the natural spirit, but as a practical matter, is you talking about just the vivifying life energy, or what are we talking about here?
No, there's a pasuk in Kehelis. Ruach ha'adam eila l'mayla v'ruach ha'behema yeredes lamata. I quoted it yesterday. And I explained it. Basically, the spirit, or you could say the breath even, of a human being rises because a man walks upright, and the breath or spirit of the animal is face downward. That I just elaborated, that an animal physiologically is all, its head faces downward.
Well, I understand.
It's very simple. One is because the animal is about survival, existence, and a human being has the capacity to be transcendent. That's what it means. The meaning of the pasuk.
I completely understand what you said and what the words mean, but we're talking about, is it the nefesh habahamis versus the nefesh elikim? Well, I mean, is ruach a synonym for nefesh? Like ruach
means ruach in the pasuk means breath. You could say spirit, but I mean,
okay.
I wouldn't read further into that. It's straightforward. The nefesh elikis is connected toward more the ruach ha'adam, and nefesh habamis, what he says, is connected to ruach ha'behema. I wouldn't connect it to nefesh, ruach, and neshama if that's what you're alluding to.
Well, I wasn't going directly there, but I was asking how ruach here in this pasuk, as used in Chassidus, relates to that hierarchy.
No, I don't know if it relates to that hierarchy. It's simply the difference between the breath or the spirit of the animal and the breath and spirit of a human.
Like, what is its essential focus or nature?
I'm not sure what's just read the pasuk, whatever the pasuk means. The pasuk is simply describing what he said here. An animal walks on all four, so its breath is face downward, which reflects its personality, that its focus is on survival and existence, on the midas. Whereas Ruach HaAdam Eila L'mayla walks upright because his seichel is higher than the midas, and he can go into matters that are sublime, elokus, and so on. And the animal focuses on its existence and survival. That's how I would. Okay.
It's from Koheles.
It's a pasuk
Yeah.
from Kelis. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Okay. So then maybe we'll just stop right here. It's a good place to stop. End of the paragraph. And obviously, this is going to continue now to explain. The Rebbe Rashab is going to continue to explain. That's why now the Avodah is, what's our Avodah? Is to start working on the Seichel of the Nefesh Habamis and to explain to it that there's more to existence than just your needs. There's more to existence than the Yesh. And that can be explained to the Nefesh Habamis. That's what he's leading toward. Again, it's all the Alter Rebbe's Maimer and Torah Er. If you look at it, it's fascinating how it's all there. But obviously, with this elaboration, it helps us really understand it fully. So we'll stop here, end the paragraph at page 1464, and we'll continue we'll continue in the next class. And again, yeah, this is now if you have the Maimon, the Alter Rebbe, and the Mittler Rebbe. I don't know if you want to overwhelm yourself, but if you look there, you'll see all of this comes. Because now we're learning it after we learned it, and I've obviously looked at it quite a few times. It's a big part of how we're learning this now in context of what it said there. But it's all really based on that, yeah. And this is going to go for another page, around another 2 pages, about the middle of page 1466, where he finishes the Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the explanation of how the Nefesh Elikis refines the Nefesh Habamis. And then we'll take it from there. He's going to go to Ner Mitzvah, but he's going to go back to the ultimate explanation of how the Nefesh Elikis, as I said, tames and transforms the Nefesh Habamis. And as I said, the Rebbe Rashab is going to end the middle of that and never really get back to the initial themes and answer some of the questions. But that's what we're doing now as we learn it the second time. Okay. Okay, so we're stopping here at the end of the paragraph 14.